Tell me you're going to replace it with some sort of ephemeral right-wing, super neoliberal...
Labour's Brexit rows go on. Outside today, two party members grappling, no holds barred. A Remainer from Liverpool, a Brexiteer from Essex.
They're working class people.
You're joking.
What can any trade union ever defend that?
How are you going to replace that trade afterwards?
The trade,
tell me.
You trade anyway.
You can just grab some literature and take it.
Last night, delegates who'd submitted more than 100 motions on Brexit met to merge them into one, what's called a composite. All options would stay on the table, they agreed, after 5 hours, but without a specific pledge to give the public a new vote on remaining in the EU. Some pro-Europeans aren't happy.
I'm more baffled than disappointed. I don't know, Michael, maybe I'm missing something, but I don't understand how you could have a second referendum or people's vote, whatever you want to call it, without the option to remain being on the ballot paper when 16 million people voted for remaining in the EU.
This lunchtime, we waited to catch up with Labour's Brexit spokesman.
Mr. Starmer, after last night, nothing's really changed, has it? You're still being all things to all people.
Last night was a meeting of delegates, and 300 delegates or so came together and reached consensus. That's a very good thing.
But nothing's changed, has it?
Yes, of course it's changed.
You're still all things to all people, all options.
The delegates have agreed a motion to put forward to conference tomorrow. Of course, we have options because we don't know what the future is going to bring.
Mr. Starmer, I'm told, initially wanted a motion more hostile to a second vote on Remain, and many pro-EU Labour voters and members may feel let down even with this compromise.
Isn't this a betrayal, Mr. Starmer? Betrayal of the millions of voters out there are hoping that Labour will give them the possibility of voting us out of Brexit? And isn't it a betrayal of Labour Party members?
Then a climb down of sorts. Mr. Starmer suddenly turned and said the options on the table would include a vote on Remain or Leave.
The meeting last night was very clear that the question of a public vote should be open. We weren't ruling out options, and nobody was ruling out Remain. And
John McDonnell
there was 300 people in the room, and that was absolutely clear.
Mr. Starmer saying there that Labour's options would include a Remain vote contrasted starkly with John McDonnell, who several times on radio this morning avoided making such a commitment. And he also avoided such a pledge in his conference speech.
We're keeping all the options open for democratic engagement on the table. But look, I feel so strongly that these Tories should face the people for the way in which they've recklessly put our country's future at risk over the last 2 years. More interested in fighting each other than fighting for this country.
The Shadow Chancellor also announced what would be the first of Labour's nationalisations, water in England.
We're also setting out our plans for a new publicly owned water system.
And the party would now force large British firms to give workers shares in the business.
We believe that workers who create the wealth of a company should share in its ownership, and yes, in the returns that it makes.
Up to £500 per worker in dividends. Britain's large employers are worried.
So the aspirations are good. Employee ownership is a good thing, but this is the wrong way of going about it. It will affect in the wrong way the pay packets of people because of the investment that it will deter, the productivity that will be lost, and ultimately the pay that people can earn.
Have you tried to persuade Labour to do it differently?
They haven't talked to us about this proposal. It was new to us last night.
We may have seen unity in the hall on economic policy, nationalisation and giving shares to workers. But Labour may not be so united tomorrow morning when we get the Whigs' big debate on Brexit.
Earlier I spoke to the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell here in Liverpool, and I began by asking him whether a people's vote on the final Brexit deal would include an option to remain in the European Union.
We're going to respect the first referendum, but there is to be a people's vote of some sort on the deal. All of that will be debated in Parliament, and we'll try, well, we want a general election, but if we can't get that, at least people have the right to have some form of democratic engagement.
Well, some sort of democratic engagement, but the movement has been to include within the choice Remain.
Yeah. I'm sure there'll be a range of views to argue for that, to go on the ballot paper itself. We'll have that debate, but the most important thing as far as I'm concerned now is to get Theresa May back from Brussels, see what the deal she's recommending is. If it can't go through Parliament, I want a general election. That's the best way of doing it.
Are you ruling out the option?
No options are ruled out. No options are ruled out.
So that includes the option to remain?
It'll be a hypothetical, it's a hypothetical discussion at the moment, but there'll be a further discussion on what can be agreed within Parliament on that ballot paper.
But that, in the aftermath of all this, does not promise the people a second chance to change their mind.
What will come out of that debate, particularly in Parliament, is if there isn't a general election, if there is some form of people's vote, what will then go on the ballot paper? Now, there'll be a range of views that will be expressed then about, do we renegotiate a deal, or do we have a new relationship with you? I believe if we could have a change of government, we could negotiate a deal with Europe which would protect jobs and the economy and ensure that we have a continuing close and collaborative relationship with Europe and bring the country back together again. You say people have changed their minds. From all the opinion polls, it looks as though the country is still split down the middle. There's been some change, but in both directions. We can't go on like this.
Why are you worried about testing it?
Well, I want to test it in the general election. I want to test it in the general election.
But that may not come, in which case...
Well, then in that case, we're keeping the option open of a people's vote.
OK. So what persuades you that you could make a better job of negotiating a Brexit of some sort?
Because all the way through, we've led this debate. We were the ones who said, look, first, you need a transitional period. The government refused, and a year later, they had to accept what we were saying. We said you need a customs union, otherwise the Northern Ireland border problem won't be resolved. I think what
a customs union would be a bottom line that you would not
It's one of the things we've already put forward. We said a customs union. We want a close relationship with the single market. We want tariff-free access. None of that...
A customs union, but why should a union of European nations give you a customs union when you've rejected the customs union?
Because I think they're open for a debate and discussion. And the point we're making about this government, they've completely mishandled these negotiations. I've said, I think we've discussed this before, where I've said, look, I've negotiated in Europe. You negotiate on the basis of mutual respect, mutual interest. You don't do this banging the table, walking away. It will not work. You build consensus. And we've been talking to our European partners. They want a deal just as much as we do. They want to protect their markets just as much as we want to protect ours.
You laid out an enormous programme for reform in your speech today. I mean, probably one of the biggest sort of legislative changes are being promised in your mythical manifesto since 1945. It's going to take an enormous amount of time, far more than one government. Just the renationalisation itself, I mean, the putting into public ownership. How long is that going to take? Water you talked about. How quickly do we get water?
Lifetime of a Labour government, we've got 5 years. I think we'll be re-elected in a second term, but within the first term, we'll lay all the foundations for this. The legislation on renationalisation should be relatively easy because it's been happening in the past. And even this government, remember, has brought rail back into public ownership when it's collapsed in different sectors. We think we can get that within our first Queen's speech, then roll it through. So when that election comes, whenever it is, we're ready to hit the deck running.
Now, you talked about bearing down on the city. There's clearly, as you said, a minority of companies that are abusing the tax system, parking stuff offshore. But you know that many of the dependent territories are tax havens. Are you going to end that?
Yes, we are. And
Cayman Islands?
Yes, if necessary. The Cayman Islands is a very good example. We put forward a tax enforcement and transparency programme 18 months ago. It's been us that have been pushing the government into the meagre measures that they've actually produced so far on tax avoidance and on money laundering. It was us who forced the government into adopting the Magnitsky Clause.
OK, but the practicalities, I mean, when you talk about that, that's an enormous thing. There's a structure of tax evasion that is built around British dependent territories, particularly the Cayman Islands. How long would it take to wind it up?
We can resolve that within the lifetime of a Labour government. Remember, look, I was one of the founders of the Tax Justice Campaign years ago when we were hosting meetings for them over 15 years ago. A lot of work has been done on this from the very beginning. I think also, actually, there's so many businesses out there that are operating ethically, ethical entrepreneurs, and we're really proud of them. Why should they be fleeced like the rest of us by people who aren't paying their way?
Well, let me ask you a final question, and it's an uncomfortable one. You have an MP here, Luciana Berger, who is a Liverpool MP, wanders around her constituency unprotected by police. She has to be protected inside this conference from people inside this conference?
Well, I don't believe it is protection for inside this conference, with the greatest respect. But what we have had in the past...
Well, hang on a minute. If she's not protected in her Liverpool constituency, why is she protected in a Liverpool conference?
Well, we're ensuring that everyone, all MPs that there may be any threat, are properly protected. Remember, Joe Cox, one of our MPs, was murdered from someone from the far right. We've just had one of our MPs in court, again because of threats from the far right, and someone in prison for it.
But you know what this is about.
Yes, I do.
This is about anti-Semitism, this is a consequence.
Yes, of course, wherever that threat comes from, wherever, we're going to protect our MPs.
And the people who stirred the anti-Semitism stuff within the party were not from the right, they were from all over the party.
And they've been dealt with. What happened was we introduced a new General Secretary. She's now dealt with all the cases that have been brought before her and done it very effectively as well, and done it on the basis of sound legal advice, where we don't believe any of those cases will stand a chance of legal challenge.
John McDonnell, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thanks a lot.
Well, now our political correspondent Michael Crick is with me now. Michael, will the Labour leadership be happy with today?
Well, overall, yes. I mean, it's been a day of new policy and eye-catching policy as well. The renationalisation of English water, shares for workers, and later you'll be talking to Angela Rayner about her plans for free schools and academies. And it was interesting to see, incidentally, the reception, the good reception Angela Rayner got this afternoon at a time when people are saying that Labour's next leader has to be a woman. But of course, all of this has been overshadowed, inevitably, given the growing crisis and the prospect of no deal, overshadowed by Brexit. And we still don't know where Labour stands on some aspects of Brexit, notably this question of would Labour countenance the idea of another in-out referendum. There's a motion that will be debated tomorrow which says all options should be on the table, including the idea of a public vote. But it seems to me clear from the noises that Jeremy Corbyn, Len McCluskey and John McDonnell have been making over the last few days, the three most powerful people in the Labour Party, that they don't really like the idea of another in-out referendum. And indeed, John McDonnell was saying to you that they've got to respect the result of the last referendum. On the other hand, Keir Starmer said to me this lunchtime that the idea of remaining in the EU would be a possible option in a referendum. So maybe we'll get clarity tomorrow.
Well, in a moment we'll hear from the Shadow Education Secretary, Angela Rayner, who today said Labour will end academy and free schools. First, MP Stella Creasy, who wants the party to offer a vote on staying in the European Union. So are you clear tonight, Stella Creasy, where the Labour Party stands on this possible people's vote?
Look, undoubtedly the debate is moving within the Labour Party. Absolutely, there are different opinions about what should be offered. But I think there's a recognition that just as if you were negotiating any kind of pay deal within a trade union, it's right that once there is a deal negotiated, the British public have an opportunity to say, is that what they wanted? Or actually, is there something else different that they want?
Tomorrow there's going to be a sort of further debate on the whole thing.
Yeah.
Are you going to be there, and what line are you going to take?
Oh, look, I'm going to support the motion because, as I say, I think the debate is moving within the Labour Party, and I'd very much like to see us as a party coming out and leading that argument within the public.
So you think the party will decide that they do want...
I hope so. I hope so. We've seen hundreds.
Because the leadership's pretty iffy about it.
We've seen hundreds of motions come from local parties across this country with members clearly saying, actually, they think this is where the Labour Party should be. They don't want to see a Tory no-deal Brexit. They do think that now, 2.5 years in, we've seen what Brexit would involve, and frankly, when you look at what no deal involves, you can realise that any deal is going to have consequences.
Do you think John McDonnell and Mr Corbyn are together?
Well, look, here's where this is where I'm possibly in a different position to a lot of people in the Labour Party, because I actually don't think any politician should set the questions. I think we should learn from the Irish referendum into abortion, a potentially divisive issue where the public actually were involved in a citizens' assembly to decide what the questions should be. Because I think the British public actually need to say, well, now we've seen the evidence, now we've seen what's on offer, what do we want to consider?
Then you have the problem.
I actually would like to see a citizens' assembly.
Then you have the problem the Conservatives raise, which is, frankly, it renders the original vote as null and void.
It absolutely doesn't, because it isn't about the original vote. But that's exactly why I think the public should be the ones, rather than politicians, to decide what is on the ballot paper. There are lots of Tory politicians who also agree that it's right, 2.5 years on, now we know what's on offer, that the public should have a say on that. But I think there's a common agreement that the public should also decide what the question is.
Right. Well, now, Angela Rayner, I think you're rather less enthusiastic about this vote, right?
Well, I think it was fantastic that we had a consensus coming out of the composite in motion. There was over 150 delegates that attended that meeting, and actually the vote tomorrow, I hope everybody endorses it, because it leaves us with opportunities.
Yeah, but does that include this question of whether people can vote to remain?
Well, it doesn't rule anything out.
Is that option on the table?
I mean, it doesn't rule anything out. That's what the composition did. And I think it's important, actually, that we look at the 6 tests that we set right at the start of this process, and that we want our economy, jobs and security as part of that deal. Nobody voted to make themselves poorer. What about you personally? Do you want people to be offered that option? I want people to get the best possible deal. I think if you ask people up and down the country...
Deal on what? Leaving Europe?
On leaving the European Union.
What about remaining in Europe?
Well, if that becomes part of where we end up because the deal is so bad, because Theresa May has failed us, then that clearly is something that the composite...
Well, it's not looking very good at the moment,
the composite allows us to do that. But actually what I want to see happen is a general election where Labour can negotiate a better deal, because actually Theresa May has failed at that and can't even keep her own party together.
We've got a few weeks to go until it has to be fixed, and it's certainly looking pretty rotten at the moment, isn't it?
Well, I think it started right at the beginning of the process when Theresa May said she was going to be a bloody difficult woman. I don't think that's helpful. We need to be constructive and we need to be clear. We were from the start on our 6 tests. If they're not met, then we said we wouldn't vote for that deal, because jobs, security and our economy has to come first.
Well, let's move on to your own portfolio, education. And you want to end academies and free schools within the next Labour government, right?
We want to put community schools back on the agenda. This government took us away from community schools. They forced local communities out of that process. And what we've seen as a result of that is fat cap pay going up within multi-academy trusts, lack of accountability to the people they're meant to serve, and that pupils, especially pupils with special educational needs and disabilities,
but you've got a problem, which is that
clearly
the Ofsted have looked at this and say that 1.9 million children are in either good or outstanding academies and free schools. What do you do about that?
Well, if you look at the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee and the reports that have been done from the Education Policy Institute, just calling something an academy is not what drives excellence. I want to drive excellence. I want to stop schools from being unaccountable.
Clearly, radically, if you hand them back to the local authorities, that is going to change the whole ethos of the school, which supposedly has produced these outstanding figures.
Well, what we want to do is schools to collaborate, to learn from each other and to put pupils first.
But how do you sustain these standards as you do that?
Well, I think you can, because if you look at London, for example, in the last Labour government, we put the London Challenge and collaboration and leadership and excellence first. That's what I want to see. I want to end the lack of accountability that's currently within this system, because that's not good for anyone.
Let's look at nationalisation. Are you happy about water being taken back into public ownership but not at its market value?
Well, I'm not happy about people, the general public at the moment, being ripped off. We want good public services. I want to drive that forward. I think John McDonnell was very clear on that today about businesses doing the right thing and that Labour will support businesses that do the right thing. But some public services that were pushed out under Tory governments actually are not giving value for money. That's including water, energy and others, including the rail, which we've seen hiked prices and yet the service has not been getting better. That's a rip-off and we want to change
now, the
that.
National Executive has been talking about having another deputy leader in addition to Tom Watson, but she must be a woman. Would you be that woman?
Well, I've been concentrating on getting through my speech today because what's important to me...
Do you favour the idea of a woman then?
Well, I think women have an absolute role to play in the Labour Party and I welcome that. I absolutely welcome that. I think it's fantastic and, you know, I will play my part in whichever way I can to deliver for my constituents in Ashton-under-Lyne and across Britain.
Angela Rayner, Stella Creasy, thank you both very much.